Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. You can tell from the title up there. Time for another review. This is, of course, of a film that I grew up with and spiked in popularity when I was entering adolescence. And that, of course, is the film directed by Henry Selick and produced by Tim Burton from a poem he wrote years prior. That, of course, is The Nightmare Before Christmas. Originally, this was released through Touchstone Pictures, one of Walt Disney Pictures' subsidiaries, but then in more recent years it has been re-released through Walt Disney. So I guess you could say that that means it's an unofficial entry in the Disney Renaissance. And if it wasn't for the fact that they rebranded it before release, it would be considered one retroactively, but it's more like the black sheep of that era, but you could throw it in there now in retrospect. Now, as you can see, when the date this goes live, this is technically not going to be a part of a certain series I'm doing, but I will still throw this in the playlist at the appropriate point. Now, this film was made for $18 million, and it made $107.8 million, so a healthy gross, especially when you go by Hollywood accounting. I mean, that's more than double. Would have started making it gross once it went around 50, so that is still pretty healthy for the 90s, but not as much as some of the other ones. But I'll say, unlike The Rescuers Down Under, it did make money. Now, the genesis for this film, you got to go back to an era that I covered a little bit in a series that is going to go live after I record this and upload it, actually, too. And that, of course, is the late Bronze Age into the Dark Age of Disney animation. For those who haven't seen that, if you're watching it way later, the Bronze Age is what I call the era after both Walt and Roy Disney passed away to about the early 80s-ish. You can kind of, I mean, there's some places where you can kind of wiggle the dates and all that, but if you're looking at it hard and fast, that's where it would be. I'd say like around the time Fox and the Hound was in production is where the flip would come over. You could maybe push to the release, but definitely like around the production era. And for that, it's because that's when some animators, including the legendary Don Bluth, jumped ship. And then, of course, the follow-up to Fox and the Hound was the release of The Black Cauldron, which the backlash from that, I think, is part of the reason why they rebranded this film eventually. Because they're like, oh crap, that might be a little too dark. We don't want to repeat. Now, in that period, Tim Burton was working at Disney as an animator. Now, if you've ever seen his art style, you would probably be wondering why. Because he has a very distinct art style. It definitely works for like his normal drawings. His normal animation, it could work. But when you are trying to replicate a certain art style that's set in stone, such as the Disney art style, not going to work. Especially since he was hired as an in-betweener. And if you don't know what that means you're the one who's doing the frames in between the main frames. And if you've ever seen the little bits of joke meme things about pausing Disney movies in the wrong places, that would probably be from the in-betweeners. As you can imagine, he did not last as an in-betweener, but the people who worked there liked him, so they kept Burton on, and he did other works. I mean, while he was there, he wrote the original poem for The Night Before Christmas, which was 3 pages, and he was inspired by Christmas specials such as Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and The Grinch, which kind of shows in the final film, which I'll get to. He showed the poem to fellow animator Henry Selick, who, in the years after this film, would go do James and the Giant Peach, which is the spiritual successor to this film, Coraline. But before that, when he was working there, he was an in-betweener on Pete's Dragon, working under Bluth, and he also was a storyboard artist on Return to Oz, which, when you think about that, makes the dark vibe in that film make a whole lot more sense. But that's a good thing. Sometimes kids got to get scared a little bit. Well, in addition to the poem thing, he also made his short film, Vincent, and he spent $60,000 and worked on it for 2 months, and it only had a 2-week theatrical run with the film techs before it went back into the Disney vault. Now, of course, years later, once Burton was a household name, they would flaunt that he made that film, because I remember in '92 on the VHS tape that I mentioned when I did my nostalgic Christmas special video a couple years ago, how they had the Nightmare Before Christmas making of thing on there. That was where I first saw Vincent, or at least parts of it. Of course, it's on my Blu-ray, which is somewhere, but shows that even though they put it back in the vault pretty quickly, they're still going to flout it. And after that, he would go on to make another short film, a little bit longer than Vincent, which of course was Frankenweenie. That one cost $1 million, was about 30 minutes. And Burton got fired for that because the higher-ups felt you were wasting company resources, which you could see why. And they felt the film was not suitable for children, which, considering this was 1984, in the wake of The Black Cauldron, you can kind of see why that is. But I have watched Frankenweenie. It's been probably about 20 years, but I came across it one night on the Disney Channel. This is back when they would show a lot of their older stuff late at night in the vault thing, and I liked it. It was one of those ones I've been meaning to watch. I saw it, I liked it, and especially being someone who grew up watching the Universal horror films like Frankenstein, which that film is a loving tribute to, I thought it was pretty good. And being too not suitable for children, I don't see how. I mean, it has a little bit of a dark edge to it, but it kind of balances that with its suburbia setting. And in a way, you could see Frankenweenie is kind of his prototype for what would eventually become Edward Scissorhands. I mean, it has that same type of vibe where you have the suburbia thing and you kind of you put it against the whole thing with darkness and all that. Now, that one also goes with the whole fairy tale vibe, but you can kind of see the beginnings of going in a story direction like that. Now, Burton, he did not flounder after that. He got hired on to do a film by comedian Paul Reubens. It's a little film you might have heard of called Pee-wee's Big Adventure. And in that film, he uses his dark edge pretty well, mainly the more fantastical parts of the film, like the dream sequences, and of course, Large Marge, and then of course, Love of Hollywood and all that in the back lot scenes, including an appearance from the mighty Gojira. And he followed that up with one of my favorite films of his, and a childhood favorite, of course, Beetlejuice. And him and Keaton followed that up again with Batman '89, which those three back-to-back showed that he was box office. And all throughout that, he never really forgot his whole thing about Nightmare Before Christmas, because he had tried to pitch it as a film, but obviously, with everything else, it didn't go through for various reasons. But then now he's a household name. Disney and other studios are trying to get him to do stuff. Like with Batman, they tried to get him to do a sequel right away, but he had no interest. It was only around 91 that he decided to do it, and that's where we got Batman Returns, which of the Batman films from that era is my favorite of the four. And around the time he was doing that, he wanted to know, okay, since I did the poem and all that stuff at Disney, do they technically own it based on what my contract was? And it turns out they did. You could say what you will about the contracts that state if you create anything, it belongs to your employer at the time. But for this one, since he did try to get it made as a film, I can see why they would have the option of first refusal on it. Now, because he was busy with Batman, he couldn't direct it himself, but he did have a hand in the production. To what degree is going to depend on what you believe about what is said. Like Selick, I got two different quotes here that kind of describe his whole thing on it. Like, here's the first one. I don't have the years for when he said these ones, though. The first one that Selick said. It's as though Burton laid the egg and I sat on it and hatched it. He wasn't involved in a hands-on way, but his hands is in it. It was my job to make it look like a Tim Burton film, which is not so different from my own films. Which is from what I've seen of Coraline, I can see why. They kind of have a similar vibe there. Now, in that one, he's pointing that Burton really was more producer and wasn't hands-on day-to-day, but his essence is there. And this is the second one where he goes a little bit more into the hands-off one. I don't want to take away from Tim, but he was not in San Francisco when we made it. He came up 5 times over 2 years and spent no more than 8 or 10 days in total. Which is true, I mean, he's busy with other projects. But it was originally his baby, even if he didn't direct it, so I could see why they branded his name over it. But I'll say at least he got someone that has a similar mindset in Henry Selick to direct it, so you get that nice little balance. And of course, hard to tell how the film would look if Burton actually had directed it himself, but that's a good what-if question. Now, like I mentioned, it was made up in San Francisco, It had a 120-person crew using 20 sound stages, which for a normal film is a lot, but for a film that is stop motion like Night Before Christmas is, that is a hell of a lot. And during peak filming, all 20 are being used. There was 227 puppets, and each of them had multiple heads in order to do the different expressions and mouth movements, and Jack alone had 400. And depending on the character, it would depend on how you would change the head from shot to shot. Like Jack himself, it's totally replaceable heads, whereas Sally, it was just the certain parts of her face. And in that making of, you actually get to see how they're moving Jack's face for one of the musical numbers. Like how they would move it, and then when they'd play it back. And for something like this, you got to be careful. Like, the main thing is with continuity, such as lighting, which we don't really think about a lot when it comes to live action, other than like subtle stuff. But for an animated thing where you're painstakingly moving each character movement by movement in order to get the whole shot in a whole like 5 seconds of film could take like a day or more to do, depending on how intricate it is. If the lighting is off at all at any point there, it could ruin the shot. Now, if it's a scene where the lighting is flickering, you can get away with it a bit more. And this is one of the things I love about the making of King Kong too, is because they talk about how in one scene there was an actual flower in the background and it bloomed while they were filming, and they didn't realize it, and then the whole day's worth of filming had to be disregarded because of that. With this, it'd be similar things if the lighting was wrong, if character movement was wrong, so you have to make sure you get everything right. So this is the type of filming where being anal retentive about everything makes sense. And one thing that is very cool about this film is how each area has its own aesthetic. Like Halloween Town, very German expressionist, which if you don't know what that is, it is a movement in film that happened in Germany during the silent era, where a lot of the backgrounds were very exaggeristic. It really lent itself to horror, like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a good example. And there, of course, it also plays in with the story, where you see those type of backgrounds mainly in the main part of the film, and then by the ending you're like, oh, maybe that was all BS. And there's other good examples, but that's my go-to, is Caligari. Whereas with Christmas Town, it is a very Dr. Seuss-inspired look, which makes sense if Grinch was one of Burton's influences. And, of course, it makes a nice little contrast between Halloween Town and Christmas Town. And then, of course, when we get to the real world in the end, it's more normal. I mean, it still has a little bit of that vibe because it's stop motion, but compared to the two towns we've been in, it is more normal. And I haven't mentioned it yet, but of course ties into Burton's influence for creating the poem, which was he saw Halloween merch being taken down and replaced with Christmas merch, and that juxtaposition is what inspired him. And I think that juxtaposition between the three different styles is what allows this film to have its own unique visual style, and of course sets each world apart. And of course, talking about filming, this is a good example of why some parts of this film are going to be hard, but they'll be worth it in the end. The shot of Jack reaching for the door apparently was the most difficult shot. Which, anytime you're going to have a shot where it involves a reflective surface, it's going to be difficult because you want to try to make sure the camera's not there. Nowadays, you could just remove it with post, but this is back where you had to do everything in camera. And looking at it, it's well worth the effort they had to do for that shot. Now, I mentioned already who the director was. The screenplay was written by Caroline Thompson, which, that's not a name that pops out at me, but when I was looking at her filmography, I'm like, oh wow, she did a lot of my childhood here. And before this, she wrote Edward Scissorhands, so she was already working with Burton. She also wrote The Addams Family, Homeward Bound: The Incredible Journey, The Secret Garden, which I used to have the VHS for, but I guess I lost it at one point. She'd also go later and write The Corpse Bride. And she wrote another film I have not seen in years, but I'm actually tempted to go back and revisit it. It's one of the ones I got the VHS for over there, and that is Black Beauty, adaptation of a classic novel. And she also directed that one of her few directing efforts. And of course, the music and songs were written by Danny Elfman. Of course, it's a Tim Burton project. We can't go 5 minutes talking about Tim Burton without mentioning Danny Elfman. Now, Elfman found this to be one of the easiest jobs he had, according to his own words, because he had a lot in common with Jack. And it was during this whole process where he was talking with Burton, talking with Henry, that he got so enthusiastic he asked to voice Jack, and they told him he had the job. Now, being that he was already an experienced singer from his time in Oingo Boingo, Elfman, of course, be able to easily do the singing part. It was when they were recording, they found his acting speaking voice to be too wooden and stiff to voice Jack. Probably not enough emotion. So that was nixed, and that's why we got Chris Sarandon voicing Jack. I mean, there's a slight difference between the voices, but you could kind of chalk that up, to Jack's voice being slightly different from when he's speaking to where he's singing. It's not different enough to where you're like, okay, I don't believe this is the same person, but there's a slight difference. And Sarandon does a great job voicing Jack. I mean, he even came back in the video game, if I remember right. Of course, if you don't remember who Sheridan is, he played Jerry in Fright Night, Detective Norris in Child's Play, and of course, Prince Humperdinck in The Princess Bride. So nice that he can play a villain or he can play a hero. Excellent. Now, the 10 songs were also written before the screenplay. Now that's a little unusual when you think about it, because usually you'd write the screenplay first, then do the songs. But I think it works to the film's advantage here, because you got the songs, you got them, okay, we got a song for this story beat, we got a song for this story beat, so you can write the dialogue around the songs, so they can flow into one another, and it doesn't feel like dialogue is repeating anything the songs are saying, and vice versa. Plus, if there's any like final note you got to do on a scene that has a musical number, you can do it in the spoken dialogue. Like in the scene where Jack is showing off Christmas to the rest of the citizens of Halloween Town, the dialogue he does afterwards puts the final bow on that scene. And of course, it allows the pacing to go at a pretty quick pace, because this is one of those films that's like a little bit over an hour, so paced pretty well. Now, I'm almost 20 minutes into this review, and I've been talking a little bit about the making of, and I haven't even talked about the plot. The plot of the film is it is set in a world where each of the major holidays has its own world. The reason I say major is because we only see a handful of doors, and if there was a world for every holiday, that'd probably get a little weird after a bit. Although, I would love to go through the door that leads to Leif Erikson Day, Inga Dinga Durgan. But, Christmas has its own town, Thanksgiving has its own town, Easter has its own town, and of course, Halloween has its own town. And we are introduced to all the citizens of Halloween Town, in particular, Sally, who is a doll, voiced by Catherine O'Hara. Then we get a mayor character, played by Glenn Shadix. And then, of course, our main character, Jack, the Pumpkin King. Like I said, voiced by Sarandon, sung by Elfman. As the film begins, it is another Halloween. They're all happy. You can tell that Jack, he's a little happy, but it looks like he's going through the motions. And as his first solo, the song points out, is that he's getting bored with his existence, and he wants some more stuff, and he just feels empty inside. But it's not like he can tell anyone. And of course, Sally listens to this, and this is where we get to see that Sally has feelings for Jack. Jack ends up wandering off. Citizens of Halloween Town the next day notice he's not there, so they get all worried and sound an alarm. Jack wanders throughout the night and ends up in the woods that is the world between all their worlds, and he ends up in Christmas Town. And he's all like, what is this? And of course, that's that song number, what's this? He's so excited about what he sees, he wants to know where he is. He finds out where he is, and he sees Santa Claus. Now he decides to share his new discovery with the rest of Halloween Town. And he's still exploring more on Christmas. He's trying to explain it with science, like what is with all this things that allows it to feel. So he's trying to explain joy. And I think this part of the film is why I loved Jack as a character when I was a kid. Because being someone with ADHD, seeing him dive into his new hobby with such fervor and such hyper-focus, it really was something I identified with. But even without having a neurodivergent condition, he's a character you could really identify with. Part of that is the writing. Of course, part of that is Sarandon's vocal performance as Jack, and then the other one, of course, is Elfman's singing performance. And then, of course, how they do all the shots around him. And eventually, Jack comes to the realization that this year Christmas has to be ours. Everyone in Halloween Town is happy and excited for it, except for Sally, because she sees why this is a bad idea, and she can't convince anyone else of why. And she keeps trying to, gently, but no one listens. So Jack and the rest of the citizens of Halloween Town get ready for Christmas in order to make sure their Christmas celebration and giving joy to the masses goes off without a hitch. Jack has 3 trick-or-treaters, lock, shock, and barrel, voiced, of course, by Danny Elfman, Catherine O'Hara, and Paul Reubens, kidnap Santa Claus. Of course, we get that song, Kidnap the Sandy Claus. Which I just love that they mispronounce his name as Sandy Claus. And they kidnap him and take him to their boss, Oogie Boogie, who is kind of a boogeyman-like thing, voiced by the late, great Ken Page. Of course, you get one of my favorite songs in the movie, his solo number. Which, with the songs, just to cut in, that's another way you can tell that this is a Disney Renaissance-esque film, because it does follow a lot of things. Of course, we've got the great villain song, we've got a song early on where the hero character states their goals, and we got a bunch of other songs, and even though they're not super bombastic, they definitely feel like they would be at home on Broadway. So just throw that in there. Now, as you can already imagine, Halloween goes wrong, and they have to set things right. And that's mainly Santa's job, of course. And it does have a happy ending, and Sally and Jack do end up together, and that's a lovely end musical number, dearest friend, that whole thing. That's a nice way to end the film. Only other person on the cast I have written down I haven't mentioned is we got William Hickey as Dr. Finkelstein, who was Sally's creator. He's kind of like a minor antagonistic figure in here because he keeps trying to keep Sally locked up and she doesn't want to be locked up. He's not really a villain. He's more antagonistic towards Sally because he does help Jack at a couple places. Then we got Ed Ivory as Santa Claus. Now, originally, they wanted to have Vincent Price voice him because by this point, Elfman and Price were friends because of all their collaborations. Unfortunately, this was when his health was going downhill. His wife passed away, and for what little they recorded, it didn't seem like it would have been useful. So the bow on his career ended up being Edward Scissorhands, which is a nice little bow on his career for him being in front of the camera. And from a thematic standpoint, of course, it's Ed Wood because, as we all know, Burton drew on his friendship with Vincent Price in order to portray the friendship between the titular character and Bela Lugosi. I think it would have been an interesting little bow on Price's career if he had been healthy enough to fully voice the character of Santa. Just think about it. His typecasting in the horror genre and in playing all those different horror characters, even if he was open to poking fun at himself, including being in the Muppets where he got bit by Kermit the Frog as a vampire, you know that his last role being Santa Claus would have tickled him in some regard, just from how he portrayed himself in public. And there would have just been something very interesting, and it would have added to the juxtaposition of the holidays if you got a man who is mainly known for horror films voicing Old Saint Nick himself. Alright. And another fun thing is that in the early 2000s, Disney wanted to make a sequel, but Burton convinced them to drop it. And part of his reason is that he felt the movie had a purity to it, and he didn't want that to be corrupted by them going to different holiday towns. Now, technically, the film did get a sequel in the form of the video game, where it involved Oogie taking over the rest of the holidays. So we kind of got that, but I think in a video game that works a bit better. And of course, Jack and the rest of the crew would be in the Kingdom Hearts games. And the fun thing is, 2001, that's around the time where the film started to spike more in popularity. Because I remember it being popular with people in the 90s. I remember loving it all throughout that. But I remember it getting bigger around the millennium. Part of that was, of course, the video games. And also its 3D re-release. And it's just had that spike in popularity ever since. And of course, don't forget the cover album Nightmare Revisited. I mean, that's where we get Korn's Kidnap the Sandy Claus. We get Amy Lee of Evanescence doing Sally's Song. Now, like I mentioned, it didn't make money, but the critical reception at the time, of course, there are people that like it. It's -1. I look at and go, okay, because this is one of what the negative con one was. Wonderful special effects did not make up for the superficial plot, weak screenplay, and one-dimensional characters. I look at that and go, okay. Okay, the special effects, which, by the way, got an Oscar nod. It's like superficial plot. It's about Jack learning that sometimes the grass is not always greener, and what you want is sometimes right in front of you. Weak screenplay, it goes with that. Now, the one-dimensional characters, okay, maybe they got that, but they're archetype characters. They're mainly there for the plot and whatever personal story growth they have. Like Jack is the Pumpkin King. Other than his arc, not really much more. The rest of the background characters, they're there to be background characters and what their plot specifies. Oogie Boogie, him being the bad guy because he's the boogeyman who has a gambling thing, doesn't really need more than that. And of course, his whole gambling thing and the hubris that comes with it is what leads to his downfall. And then, of course, Santa Claus. Do we really need more depth to him in the film that there is? It's freaking Santa Claus. Sometimes Santa being played as is, with how his lore portrays him, is what we need. And that's what we get here. And of course, not all of it was bad. I mean, here's the Rotten Tomatoes consensus. The Nightmare Before Christmas is a stunningly original and visually delightful work of stop-motion animation. Excellent. But, go with that. Every film is going to have someone that doesn't like it, or a film that most people hate is always going to have someone that does like it. Each their own. It's just reading that consensus for the negative, like, I don't get it. I mean, I could get if you do not connect with the plot. I can get if you didn't connect with the characters. I can get if you just, for whatever reason, don't like stop-motion animation. Even when it is taken to this zenith. But that one is like, yeah. And it's, I guess, things like that where I kind of take a lot of the critics with a grain of salt. I'll give them props when I agree with them. Especially those two, the fat guy and the skinny guy. Alright. That's really all there is to talk about with it, because I've covered everything on here. But it definitely is a film that you should watch if you are a fan of Burton and you haven't, which I would question why you haven't. Not watching something like Ed Wood I would get, but this, wow. If you are showing your kids different animated films, if you're going to like go throughout, jump back and forth throughout the history of it to show them different ones, this is definitely one to show for the 90s. Or if you're showing them the ones you grew up with first, definitely should be on the list. I still have my childhood copy over there, and I got the Blu-ray there, and like I said in other ones, if I ever do have children, this is definitely one that they are going to be watching early on. With that, I'd probably show them the Burton films in order. See if they like that aesthetic. Anyway, that's really all I have to say about the film. And until next time, everybody.